Well, good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the USTV Lunch and Learn. My name is Rabbi Ephraim Guttentag, the community rabbi at Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts on this week's Parasha's Vayikra, the first parasha in the book of Leviticus, and we will also share some Pesach thoughts, some short snippets, a few different things that you can share with your families over your Shabbat meal, over your Seder. I'm going to start straight away with Vayikra. So Vayikra is the first parasha, and as I said, in the third book of the Torah, Vayikra, known as Leviticus. Why is it called Leviticus? Because the word Levi, right? The tribe of Levi, where Moses and Aaron were from. And it's made, this whole book of Leviticus is to do with the temple service and how our lives back in temple times and in the time of the tabernacle in the desert, as we were traveling, our whole life revolved around the service of God. And the service at the temple was led by the Levites and the Kohanim, hence the name Leviticus. So the first word in the entire book is Vayikra. Vayikra, a Moshe that God called unto Moshe. And if you look in the Chumash and in the Sefer Torah as well, Vayikra is spelled Vav Yud Kuf Resh Aleph, but the Aleph very, very small. What's the reason for that? So as we know, the Torah was written by Moses, but dictated to Moses by God. As we say when we do Hagba, Al Pi Hashem Biyad Moshe, through the mouth of God, but through the hand of Moses, through the hand of Moshe. And when God told Moshe Rabbeinu to write Vayikra, that God called on him, that, this is Moses, this is your calling. You are my chosen one. You've led the people out of Egypt. The Torah was given through you. Moses was being very humble about it. And Moshe Rabbeinu himself was a very humble man, as the parasha teaches us in Parashat Ba'aloshecha. It says, Moshe Anav Mikol Adam. Moses was the humblest of all men who ever lived, which is a very strange thing to write, because if he wrote that, right, it's not very humble to say that you are humble. There's kind of an oxymoron going on there. Right? To say that you are humble shows that you're not humble. So what's going on? So we need to understand what true humility actually is. So humility doesn't mean denying your good qualities and not admitting to the things that you are good at. Right? If a person recognizes what his strengths are, it's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, to recognize that the strengths he's got are a gift from Hashem, a gift from God to be used in the right way. So let's say you've got a nice voice and someone asks you to, take part in the shul service, and you say, no, it's not such a good voice. It's fake humility, that, right? If you've got a gift, use it, but use it for the right thing. So Moshe Rabbeinu, he knew he was humble. He knew what his qualities were, but he used it for the right thing, to the extent that he could even write those words that he was the humblest of all, because he knew what he was. I remember my teacher, Rabbi Karlebach, in Yeshiva teaching us, he said it works better in Yiddish. He said, if somebody doesn't know his shortcomings, he said it's oivei, because if you don't know your shortcomings, you don't know what to work on in life. Right, but he says, but if somebody doesn't know his strong points, he said it's oivavoi. He says even worse, because we need to hone in on our good points and really maximize our potential by recognizing what we're good at and focusing on that and really becoming the best that we can. So Moshe was humble. Yet when it came to here Vayikra, he didn't want to write that God called him. He wanted instead write Vayikar without an aleph, which is another word to be called. As when God called on Bilam, who was a non-Jewish prophet, he said, Vayikar Hashem al Bilam. God, Vayikar kind of chanced upon him. So he didn't actually call him, but God chanced upon him, and then they spoke, and he was a prophet, etc. So Moses wanted it, God, chanced upon me as well. But Hashem says, no, it's got to be Vayikra. I actually called you. I chose you. You're the main man here. So he did it with a small aleph, kind of a compromise. Humble enough to say, I don't want to show off that, God called me. But on the other hand, he had to write it. It's a kind of a compromise. He did a small aleph. But the message from this really is that the word Vayikra, which means that, God chanced upon him, things happen. Same word in Hebrew as mikra, right? Something, it just happened. And Hashem is saying, no, nothing just happens. It's a calling from God. And this really is a message for everything that happens in our lives, right? Sometimes you can think, well, just by coincidence, this happened, and I happened to bump into this person, and then I got this bug, and this deal that I made happened to work out very well, and sometimes we forget that there's God involved in anything at all. It just happened, coincidence. Hashem says, no, you've got to put that aleph in there. He said, everything that happens is a calling from God. Anything that happens to us in our private lives, and anything that happens to the world in general, is that God is behind it, and it's a calling from God. So that's the first thought from this, etc. The next verse, this is a separate thing, so you can take different snippets. It says, Adam ki yakud miken korban laHashem. If a person shall bring a korban to Hashem. What's the word? Korban means an offering to Hashem, right? There were many, many offerings, but the word korban is from the word karov, to become close. And the whole idea of sacrifices and bringing offerings, there was the vegan option as well, by the way, the flour offering and the wine and the oil that was brought up. But it says the word Adam. It doesn't. Normally it would say ish. It doesn't say ish. It says Adam. Why does it say Adam? So the commentators say that Adam is actually a reference to Adam Arishan, the first man alive, because the first man alive, God gave him the whole earth, the whole land, the whole world. He said it's for you, la'avta or la'shamra, for you to work it and to guard it and to enjoy of its fruit. And everything that Adam had in his hand, 100% belonged to him. There was no opportunity for thievery, couldn't steal anything, it was completely his. And the reason why the Torah here uses the word Adam is to teach us that when you're bringing an offering, when you're doing a mitzvah, it's got to be completely yours, right? And it's pretty logical as well, right? As a missionary teacher, you can't steal a lulav on Sukkot and then stand there making a bracha, and you shake the lulav. What sort of mitzvah is that, right? You can't do a lulav, you can't do a mitzvah with stolen property. And this is what the Torah is teaching us. Adam, just as Adam did everything where it's 100% his, you can't do a mitzvah if it's not completely yours. It reminds me of someone I know who went to his Rav, Rabbi Zimmerman, with a beautiful esrog. And as you know, before Sukkot, there's different price ranges. You can get the ready-made sets for 18 quid, or you can really get like the best, most beautiful esrog with not a tiny little speck on it. And they charge you more for that. So this guy was really excited. You've got, the highest level, super Aleph AA star esrog, £100 esrog. And really excited. He took it to the Rav. And he said, Rabbi, look at this beautiful esrog as I find, is it kosher? Obviously he knew it was, but you wanted to, see the Rabbi, is it kosher? The Rabbi, gets very rabbinic, when you put your glasses up there and looks at it, he looks up at the guy and he says, for you, it's not kosher. He says, what do you mean? Not kosher? It's the best esrog I've ever seen in my life. What do you mean it's not kosher? And the rabbi said to him, he said, I know that you are paying reduced school fees because of your financial straits. And, you've applied for bursaries for education, and, the school have let you get away with, paying the minimum, not the full amount that they would expect of parents. And he says, if that's your situation, what right have you got to spend all this money on an esrog when you can get a perfectly kosher one for 20 quid? He said, it's for you, it's not kosher. I think that's a really, really powerful message. That it's very nice. You want to do a mitzvah, the hiddur, and you're doing it with the whole heart, etc. But is it your money to spend when you owe your children's teachers money, right, for what they're doing for your children? That's a very powerful message. There's an expression in Yiddish called being frum on jener's cheshbon, right? So, you want to do a mitzvah, but if it's going to put somebody else out, then it's just not good enough. And it's not just about money. It could be about, let's say you're standing during the Amidah, and you're standing right at the entrance of the shul, and you're blocking the way. So you might be praying with all the wonderful concentrations that I'm sure you will do. But then you're causing inconvenience to so many other people at the same time. And we need to always consider that when doing a mitzvah, it's got to be at no one else's expense. Hence why the Torah says the word Adam. because Adam did it because he owned the world, right? And it wasn't at the expense of anyone else. That's our second message. We're going to go on to a third idea now. So I mentioned earlier that there's many different options when it comes to bringing a korban. There was the big bull, cost you a lot of money. There was the sheep, and there was the bird option. And if you couldn't afford that, there was the vegan option, right? And the Torah says, and there's many different categories of the type of how you would bring that offering up. And one of them is a korban olah. Olah means to go up, same word as aliyah, right? And a korban olah would be completely burnt up on the altar. And so it gives the details of how to bring a bird offering. And it says that you should put the whole thing benot sasa with its feathers. And after it's been slaughtered, you put it on the altar and it will burn up. And Rashi even points out that benot sam mamish with the feathers as well. The whole thing would get burnt, including the feathers. Now, I don't know if you've ever burnt a feather. Sometimes, well, after bedikat chametz, the next morning, we'll stick the feather in the fire as well. And it shrivels up very quickly and it smells disgusting. Very pungent smell. It's an awful smell. Yet, the Torah says here that you burn the whole thing up with the feathers. And it says, Ishei reach nichayach l'Hashem. It is a beautiful offering to Hashem. Reich nichayach, a fragrant offering to Hashem. Now, physically, it's really not fragrant at all. It's an awful smell. But the Torah says this is a pleasant smell in God's eyes, because God's not looking at it with our physical senses. He's looking at it from a godly point of view. And from a godly point of view, you've got this person who wants to bring an offering, and they can't afford a bull. It's too expensive. They can't afford the sheep. So they've scraped their halfpennies and pennies together, and they've managed to come up with a bird, and they go to the temple, they go to the tabernacle, and they do all the prayers, they pour the heart out, and they appoint the Kohen to do it on their behalf. And they're doing it so wholeheartedly, and they're praying, and they feel so connected with Hashem, right? Korban is karov, they're so close to Hashem. And if you look at it from that point of view, then indeed it is a reach nichayach l'Hashem. That is a beautiful fragrance to Hashem. Yeah, okay, so what? Physically, there's a bit of a pungent smell going on here. But in Hashem's eyes, if you look at the whole picture, it is indeed reich nichayach. And again, that is, I think, a very powerful message. Sometimes, we see people doing things which you think, oh, they're not so pleasant, and why did they do that? But if you look at the whole picture, the small things that they do and how meaningful that is to them, and we just sometimes look at things through a godly lens, it will indeed, even to us, look as a reich nichayach l'Hashem, as a beautiful fragrance. Fourth message from the offerings today. So you would think Vayikra is all about offerings. Well, how is that related to us? But as you can see, there's so many messages we can bring out to our daily lives here today. So one of the laws about the offerings is that you'd have to salt the meat, and that was the only ingredient that was allowed to be added to it. Right? Or mustn't. It says v'chol sa'ar v'chol devashle saktirim mimenu ishel Hashem. You mustn't add any honey. You mustn't add flour, because the temple was Pesach the whole year there, except for the showbread. Okay, but in the offerings, you weren't allowed to add any chametz, any flour, except for the flour offering was done in a particular way. But see, it wasn't quite Pesach the whole year. But you weren't allowed to add any chametz or any honey to the offering, to the meat. What's the message behind that? Honey is very delicious. You have meat in a honey mustard glaze. It's delicious, right? But what does that do? It adds an outside flavor to the meat. So the meat tastes, so you're tasting the meat and you're tasting the honey, and they do go very nicely together. But the Torah says the only thing that you can add is the salt, because salt is the only ingredient where it doesn't add a flavor of honey or mustard or even pepper or spice or chili or curry or whatever, your shawarma spice, whatever you want to add to it. It doesn't add a spice. Salt brings out the flavor of the essence of the food that you've got there. So if you're cooking chicken soup without salt, it's very bland. Once you add salt to it, the salt makes the chicken soup taste of chicken soup. Right? If you're doing anything, pasta, salt brings out the flavor of the pasta. Salt brings out the flavor of the bread. Salt, the nature of salt is it brings out the best of the flavor of what is already there. And again, I think you can probably see where I'm going with this, that when it comes to our own spiritual growth, and that and this is a message for educators, for teachers, for rabbis, for parents, and for ourselves as well, that sometimes, we'll try and do things that we're not so good at, and we'll try other things, and we'll try sometimes to be what we're not. The Torah is teaching us, don't try and be what you're not. Add salt. That means bring out the best in you. Be the best person that you can be. Right? And that relates back to what we said at the beginning about knowing your strengths and humility. Know what your strengths are. Add salt to it. And that means hone in on those skills and those talents that you've got and be the best that you can be. Don't add anything else. Just the salt. Bring out the best. So that's the message from the idea of adding salt thing. So that concludes what I wanted to share with you on the parasha this week. What I'd like to do for the second half of this session is to share some nice thoughts about Pesach, about the Seder, maybe some nice ideas that you can share with your family over the Seder meal, or even if you're on your own, some good insights that could accompany you along the way. So before the main part of the Seder, eating obviously, but before we get there, there's a lot of work to do. We've got the Haggadah to read and the story of the Exodus. But even before we start the Exodus story, we dip the karpas, the vegetable, into salt water. Once we finish the story, there's another dipping, right? We dip the bitter herbs into the sweet charoses. And as you know, this is one of the questions of the Manish Tana. Why do we dip twice? So it's not just why we dip, it's also the timings of, I'm trying to get the camera sorted, the timings of when we dip as well. So we dip before we tell the story, and we dip again after we tell the story. Because there were two dippings related to the story of the Exodus. How did the Exodus all start? With Joseph and his brothers, right? Joseph didn't get along with his brothers. The brothers hated him. They threw him into a pit, basically forgot about him, and they dipped his colored coat into blood, and they took the coat back to their father, to Yaakov, and Jacob said, Torah, Yosef, my son is lost. And they tried to trick their father into thinking that he'd been torn up by a wild beast. Obviously, the end of that story was that Joseph was pulled out of the pit, sold as a slave down to Egypt, thrown into the dungeons there. And then, of course, he was promoted to become the viceroy of Egypt, and he was the second in command of Egypt. And once there was a famine in the land of Israel, but while Egypt was plentiful, so Yaakov and all his children, there were 70 of them altogether, came down to Egypt from Israel to get something to eat. And that's where they settled, and that's where the whole exile began. So the whole story of the exile began because of jealousy, because of the incident with the brothers and the dipping of the coat into the blood. So we start the Pesach story by in memory of that, by dipping the karpas into salt water, because that's how it all started. It also finished with dipping. How did it finish with dipping? Because the night of the killing of the firstborn, that was the same day when God gave them commandment to bring the paschal lamb, to bring the korban Pesach. And that's when Hashem instructed Moshe to instruct the people to take a hyssop plant, dip the plant into the blood, right? This is the dipping here. Dip the plant into the blood of the paschal lamb and paint that blood on the doorposts and on the lintels of your homes, of the Jewish homes, and God will pass over those homes, hence the name Passover, that the firstborns in those homes will not be struck down. So the story began with the dipping, the story ended with dipping. And we left Egypt and we survived the 10th plague because of the dipping. So when we finish the Haggadah, when we finish Magid, we also dip the bitter herbs into the charoses. So there's two dippings, the one before, one at the end, to replicate the story, how the exile began with the dipping and finished with a dipping as well. Now, on a similar vein, this is a different thought, but connected. We talk about the four sons, the wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. Now, we give appropriate responses to each kid. and each one according to their level, which is a lesson in its own right, right? When it comes to parenting, it's not one size fits all. You can have, 4 or 5 kids, all different, and our job is to hone their skills and to do what's right for them. Chanach lena'ar al pi darko, each according to their ways. But to the wicked one, so he says, Mazai, what's this all about? Why do we need to bother with these things? And we give some very strange answers to him. So we start off with the usual, God took us out of Egypt and he saved us. But then we add, Ilu hayusham lo hayonigel. Had he been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. Very strange thing to say, that we're telling the wicked one that he wouldn't even have been redeemed from Egypt. Why are we saying that? Isn't he our child? So talking about the dipping of the blood and the mitzvah that we got at the time to paint the blood on our doorpost for the Passover. So God commanded Moses to command the Jewish people so to do. Now the wicked person just wouldn't have listened. Don't you, Moses, tell me what to do, right? I'm not bothering painting this blood on my doorpost and slaughtering this lamb and dipping this plant in blood and getting blood on my doorpost. I'm not doing that. So he wouldn't have done it. And then the simple fact would have been that his house would not have been passed over and the firstborn would have been struck down. It's really as simple as that, because he didn't listen to the command of God. Lo hayunigal, he would not have been redeemed. But it's not just someone who's wicked and willfully disobedient, not listening. But sometimes even often you hear people saying, I mean well, I'm a good Jew at heart, and God knows I mean well. I'm not wicked. I'm not going to bother doing the mitzvahs. I keep kashrut in my heart. I don't mean to eat this, but I'll do it anyway. So even sometimes when, it's not coming out of malice, we just don't bother. It's quite harsh, I'm sorry. But this is what the wicked son is being told, that, it's very nice, you mean well, and you're a good Jew at heart, and you mean, but end of the day, you didn't do it. You didn't do the mitzvah. You didn't carry out the command from God. So your house simply would not have been passed over. It's quite a sharp message, and repeat it at your peril. And my final thought for today, on a complete different note, but also to do with the Seder night, is the paragraph that we talk about in the answer to the Manish Tana. So we've had the 4 questions. Why is this night different? And we say because Avodim Hayinu Lefarib Mitzrayim, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out. And then we add on, we say, had God not taken us out of Egypt, right? Had God not taken our forefathers out of Egypt, then we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Had God not taken us out of Egypt some 3,330 something years ago, we would still be enslaved. I think that's a very odd thing to say, surely, because, things have happened in the past millennia of history. What about Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation of Slave Act, and especially in very recent history with with slavery? Would we seriously still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt? That, that we're saying, had God not taken us out, would still be there? Surely we'd be free by now, you would think. So many answers to this. It's a well-known question, many answers to this. And the most common one is that it's talking about the emotional slavery. It's not the spiritual slavery. Yes, of course, we'd be physically free by now, but we would still have what's called slave mentality. And that's what God took us out of. The story of a guy who used to spend his days in the apartment buildings in Jerusalem, fundraising for himself. He didn't work, couldn't work. And he would, every day would walk up and down the steps in the apartment buildings, knocking on people's doors, saying, I've got no money. Would you like to give me some of your tzedakah? And that's how he spent his days, and that's how he earned his money. And, he would do sometimes quite well for himself, but he would always, once a week, he'd buy himself a lottery ticket. And one of his friends said to him, he says, I know you're struggling with money, and times are tough, and you're buying yourself the basic minimum, but why did you buy yourself a lottery ticket as well? And he said, well, obviously, because for me, it's worth it. It cost me a couple of shekels, but if I can win millions, it's a worthwhile investment. So he says, okay, fair enough. But let me ask you, if you do win the lottery, what are you going to do with it? He says, do you know what I'll do? If I win the lottery and I have so much money, I'm going to go around the whole of Jerusalem and make sure that every single building, every high-rise building has a lift installed, so that when I do my collections, I don't have to go trudging up the stairs, up and down the whole time, wearing myself out and protect my knees. I can go in a lift and then walk my way down slowly. And then the collecting will be easier for me. So his friend says to him, you idiot, if you win the lottery, you won't need to go collecting, right? So a schnorrer who wins the lottery can still remain a schnorrer because he still has that mentality. And this is what we're thanking Hashem for, not just taking the Jews out of Egypt, but also for taking Egypt out of the Jews. We're a free nation physically, and we are a free nation spiritually as well. And this is hinted to in the verse as well, because before we left Egypt, God says, I'm going to take you out of Egypt, and you will know that I'm the Lord. Ani Hashem asher tzeises chameres Mitzrayim. So when it first says, I will take you out from the burdens of Egypt, it says, I'm going to take you out mitachas sivlois Mitzrayim, from the burdens of Egypt. And sivlois is spelled in Hebrew samach veis lamed sof. And above the lamed, you've got the little dot, sivlois or sivlot, depending what your pronunciation is. But when it says it the second time, that Hashem says, once I've taken you out, you will know that I am God who took you out. Mitachas sivlot Mitzrayim, under the burden. It says sivlot spelled differently. Samach veis lamed vav sof. Right, so the first time it doesn't have a vav, the second time it does have a vav. And we know that every single word in the Torah, every single letter in the Torah has a reason. So why the first time does it say it without a vav and the second time with a vav? Because the first time is when God is, while we're still in Egypt and we're still stooped in deep enslaved mentality, where we're being oppressed, where we're being abused. And sometimes when you're deepest depth, when you're at a low point, one often doesn't realize just how low one is. So it says sivlot without a vav because we didn't actually realize the magnitude of how bad things were. So I'm going to take you out of this. Once we're out of it and we've been elevated, then we'll realize, wow, we were really deeply entrenched back then. We have come so far up. We were so low back then. And that's why when it repeats it, once we're out of Egypt, and God says, then you will know that I am the Lord your God who took you out. Mitachas sivlot Mitzrayim. It says it with the vav because by then we'll realize the indeed how low we were. So when we answer the Manishtana and we say, the tonight is different from all of the nights because God took us out, and then we indeed express our thanks to Hashem for taking us out of Egypt, because had He not taken us out, we'd still be there. We're thanking Hashem for taking us out, not just physically, but spiritually as well. And we have the opportunities now to be free. Now, freedom doesn't just mean that we could, the ability to do what we want, but freedom is the opportunity to do what we have to do. We can lead a free life. We are lucky that we have freedom of religion, and we can do so much, and we can be indeed, as we said earlier, true to ourselves, be free within ourselves, and really maximize our own potential and be the best we all can. And may God bless us all that we should indeed become the best people that we can be. And thank you all for joining today. Have yourself a lovely afternoon, a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Sameach. Thank you.